Hi everyone, my name's Amar. I recently took the MCAT and got my score back and wanted to share my study plan, any tips and tricks, and then kind of a review of my actual exam day with you all. But I'm going to go ahead and put little markers along the timeline so you guys can click through and watch whatever part you'd like to. And then a bonus is I have my score reaction at the end. So stick around for that. But without further ado, we will get into it. Okay, so first, some background on me. I went to Virginia Tech and majored in neuroscience, specifically clinical neuroscience. With my prerequisites, most of the subjects were a mixed bag, so some of the concepts stuck, but most of them didn't really stick at all. But I wasn't really focused on retaining most of the information and then applying it in the future, which could have been helpful for the MCAT, but that's giving you guys more insight into the kind of student I was going into taking the exam. Okay, so next I'll share what I used to study. So my entire study plan was self-guided. I had considered getting a self-paced kind of, I think it was a Kaplan course, just so I would have an outline of what I was supposed to study and what I was supposed to do depending on the day. But I knew for me personally, I don't respond too well to rigid study schedules, so I decided to just go with my own plan and kind of do day to day what I wanted to. I started off with an AAMC sample full length, outright with no content review, but in general, I just wanted to get familiar with how the exam looked. After I got my score back and saw how I did and what my strengths and my weak points were, I purchased a subscription to UWorld. I used UWorld for the most part for most of my studying. I would go into a lot of the questions and passages and concepts blind, and then kind of go from there depending on how I did. So a lot of my UWorld would then be funneled into kind of this content review phase that I had. In all, I didn't end up doing any formal content review in terms of going through the books and kind of reading everything I might have been expected to learn. And I did this for me because I didn't want to be overwhelmed by the amount of information that I found in the Kaplan books that I was using. Outside of that, I used Jack Weston for cars. I felt like it was pretty good practice for cars. All in all, I spent 4 months studying, starting from October and then taking my exam in mid-January. For the first couple months, I was mainly practicing UWorld and then occasionally doing full-length and half-length exams just to test where I was at and then assess my weak points. I started using Anki about a month into studying, just to get a lot of the concepts that I was continuing to miss, and then kind of fill in the gaps of the little things that I needed to know, let's say for biology, chemistry, and psych. So I had a different deck depending on what the different subjects were. To clarify my understanding and kind of fill in any content gaps that I had, I would turn to Khan Academy, YouTube, and just generally Googling concepts and finding different websites and links and YouTube videos. I found that that was the most helpful way to learn them. Another little pro tip was I would look up a certain concept and then put MCAT at the end, because a lot of times there'll be a really complicated concept, but for the MCAT, you only specifically need to know a portion of that information rather than the whole concept from top to bottom with every little detail in there. Around the half point of my study timeline, I received 5 free exams from Altius Prep. I found Altius to be really helpful. The full lengths were pretty representative of what I had experienced on test day, and then every single question on every single one of the full lengths has an associated video of a tutor going through it. But I found those to be immensely helpful and did those consistently for the rest of my time studying. Like most other people, I ended up doing the AAMC content for the entire last month of my study timeline. I ended up going through all of the full lengths for the AAMC, and didn't really utilize a lot of the question banks for any of the subjects really, because I felt like all the full length questions were enough practice for me, and I didn't want to push myself too hard going into the exam and burn myself out potentially. All in all, I'd done 12 practice exams from Altius, AAMC, and one from Blueprint that I had found for free, which I had also found really helpful. So I would also recommend Blueprint for additional practice exams. Okay, now I'm going to get into section-specific advice. I think every section is kind of its own monster, and it's tough to know when to apply different strategies and how to approach each one, so hopefully this is going to be helpful. So for Chem Phys, this is actually the section that I had started studying for first inadvertently. I'd started memorizing amino acids as soon as I started studying, just because I remember seeing those on my sample full length that I took. I wrote out a diagram, used Anki to review the ones that I would keep getting wrong, and then also played a game on my phone. All three of those things helped me nail those down, because those are absolutely necessary to learn if you want as many points as you can, because a lot of times those amino acid questions are gimmies. This is advice specifically for all four of the sections, in my opinion. Is there are a lot of questions that if you study these certain portions, or kind of what people will call higher yield materials, you can potentially get a lot of points consistently as you take your practice exams. So an example is learning your amino acids or learning your metabolic pathways, but learning them in the right way, where you know the information that AAMC wants you to know rather than every single thing about everything. I found that I was making a lot of math mistakes initially as I started studying, and didn't correct this until about a month out from my exam. And I did this by following the Leah for Psy math tutorial for the MCAT, which I will link in the description below. It was a worksheet and then a couple of videos that you would go through. All in all, it took me maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And from then on, I rarely made math mistakes for the MCAT, and I would get through those questions a lot quicker. This is another tip for MCAT studying in general, is there's a lot of questions that are designed to take a lot of time, and what you want to do is also minimize the amount of time that you take on those in some way. So some of the questions, it's very difficult to kind of minimize the time that you have, but the math questions are an example where if you can figure out the right way to do it by following the Leah for Psi method, for example, you can really get a lot of time back that you can use on more difficult questions that you might have trouble with. Another tip I have for chemistry and physics is finding practical examples of the laboratory techniques. I frequently made mistakes on the different lab techniques, and it was very difficult to remember which ones were which, what the reasons you would do one over the other were for. But I found it was really helpful when I would finally Google whatever the laboratory technique was and find an image or find a video where they were doing the thing, and that helped me visualize why you might use, let's say, SDS page versus Southern blotting or something like that. A final piece of advice for this section is utilize the internet as much as you can when learning a lot of these concepts. I'm talking mnemonics, weird little tricks to remember them, anything that can take this big bundle of information you have to know and compact it into as small of a space as you can get it into your brain, because there's a lot of other things you need to remember in order to do well in the MCAT. Okay, next is cars, everyone's favorite section from what I've heard from my friends, acquaintances, people on the internet. So first tip for the cars section is to forget about any biases or opinions you might have about the subject you're reading about. A lot of the cars passages tend to be about subjects that people tend to have strong opinions about or preconceived notions about. So you want to stick to the information that you have in the passage and only answer the questions based off of that. Another tip or discovery that I had made while studying for cars is that they throw in very specific info from the passages at times to throw you off. So the question will be kind of vague, and they'll have a part that might be a direct quote from the passage. But as long as you stay calm and read for what the question is asking for, and only answer what the question is asking, you'll get the right answer rather than potentially panicking and clicking the one that sounds like something they had said in the passage. Another helpful tip is obviously to focus on the main idea of the passage, which in most cases is going to be in the first paragraph or the beginning sentence of the different paragraphs in the passage. One thing that I specifically did was I would highlight for the third paragraph, I would highlight one of the first couple words just so I knew that that was the third paragraph, because a lot of times the questions would say that, in the fourth paragraph or the second or the first or something, and I would take time to count the number of paragraphs and find what they were talking about. So that helped me save some time when going through the questions and then reading back through the passages. And with cars, it's very important to conserve your time because it's really easy to run out by the end of it. Another tip is that some answers in cars relate to the passage and are even correct in what they're saying, but they don't necessarily relate to the question. So it's really easy to kind of like skim over the question, read something and be like, yes, that's exactly what they're saying, and then like choose it. But it's not answering the question. So cars is really about not only timeliness, but attention to detail. So if you're not fully locked in and paying attention to what's going on, what they're saying, what they're asking, and what the answer might be, it's easy to miss a lot of points. Okay, next for bio and biochem. First, biggest piece of advice, in my opinion, is do not get overwhelmed when you're reading the passages. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. At least it was for me. It tends to happen when you see a lot of graphs, statistics, names of things you've never heard about before. But as long as you stay calm, a lot of times the passages are simpler than they seem. Once again, nail down your amino acids, make sure you know what you need to know about them. A specific piece of content advice is to draw out the metabolic pathways and see how they relate to one another. So I'd started off learning glycolysis, and despite learning biochemistry in college, I forgot what gluconeogenesis was. So it sounded like this totally foreign concept that I had to relearn and have a special place in my mind separate from the one for glycolysis, let's say. But once I wrote down the different metabolic processes and saw a specific diagram that I found on MCAT Reddit, it was easy to figure out not only that those were reverse processes and used a lot of the same enzymes, but all these other processes that I had read or heard about all feed into each other. Another piece of advice is to dumb down confusing topics, which you can also apply to the other 4 sections. But for biology specifically, what I found helpful was, as I was reading the passage, I would draw a simple diagram where I would write down different terms from the passage that I was reading and arrows and explaining kind of how they were all connected. So let's say this thing increases the production of this thing, but then this thing has like a negative feedback connection. There's all these arrows, there's all these terms. So when they do ask you questions about what you just read, you can refer back to what you've written and hopefully dumb down what you read in the passage, where they like to make it sound a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's also important to find patterns in your studying, specifically with biology and biochem. I found a lot of patterns with the functional groups and naming with the functional groups, which I hadn't noticed before when I was studying these topics in undergrad. An example for me that really helped and then kind of shaped the way that I was learning different topics afterwards was the functional group of an aldol, which I try to learn on its own and just kind of commit that to memory. But it was a lot easier when I was able to relate it to other concepts like aldehydes, which I kind of knew what they look like, and alcohols, which when you put them together, it's an aldol. So if you can relate different concepts either within the same subject like biology or with different concepts, like relating a biology concept to a psychology concept, it makes it a lot easier to remember everything that you need to. A final piece of advice with biology is to really pay attention to words like not, accept, things like those. I found that a lot of times I would kind of skip over those or forget that they were in the question and then answer them incorrectly. I found that sometimes it was helpful to write a big not on my scratch work just to remember that this question is asking for an exception. Okay, finally, psychology, which I ended up doing the best at for my actual exam. The biggest thing for this is practice, memorization, and repetition. With UWorld, I was practicing a lot of psych questions, whether they were passage-based or standalone, and I found that a lot of the topics would kind of repeat once I had done enough, and that really helped me commit them to memory. Outside of that, I ended up making a lot of psychology Anki terms as I was studying throughout, just little things that I didn't know what they meant or little things that kept showing up that I kept missing. I had looked into the 300-page Khan Academy document and just felt like I would not feel good if I read that whole thing, so I didn't end up doing that. But I know it's a really helpful resource for a lot of people. So I can't completely say that it's not helpful, but it wasn't helpful for me personally. It was helpful, however, to have it open and then control F certain concepts as needed. And sometimes the descriptions in that document were helpful, but other times I would go to Khan Academy or YouTube or something. Another really helpful piece of advice for psych is to try to assume what things mean. No matter what, you're always going to read something on the MCAT that you've never read about before. But with psychology specifically, a lot of the words you can kind of piece together depending on the way they're structured or the kind of like root words or what they sound similar to. So try not to panic if you read a word that you've never seen before when you were studying, because a lot of times the test is designed for you to just assume what these things mean rather than commit them to memory. Final biggest piece of advice for psychology is stay awake. It can be really easy to just like itch to get out of your seat, get out of the test room, and move on with your life. But it's super important to get as many points as you can with not only the first three sections, but also psychology. Okay, so next I'll get into my testing strategy. I thought a lot about my specific test taking strategy outside of academics and learning all the information. So I'd read several times that you should eat a breakfast that you've eaten before or eaten consistently in the past and you know you'll react well to the morning of the exam. So I ate what I normally do eat for breakfast, and I found that there wasn't any potential variables of like a stomach ache or not having energy or anything like that, so that was helpful. Another piece of advice is to obviously sleep well before the exam. It can be really stressful trying to get to bed, the night before this big exam, but it can be helpful to practice doing that a couple nights or even a couple weeks before the exam. I personally didn't end up practicing that up until the last couple nights before my exam, just getting to bed early and then trying to wake up early. I would also practice waking up early and then reading a passage or any piece of information like an article in the news just to get my brain used to working that early. I would have a snack and use the bathroom during every break that I had, so that's the 10s and the 30. And then I would also try to keep track of the times during the breaks so I didn't eat into my actual test time. If absolutely needed, I also would try to kind of close my eyes, deep breathe if I felt myself getting too overwhelmed during the exam. Sometimes a simple refresh for like 10 seconds can really make a difference, getting you focused and energized and back into whatever you're reading at the moment. Okay, so finally I have my personal test day experience. I had booked my exam the day that they opened for January, and despite attempting to book it right as they opened at whatever the time was, I was still maybe 10,000th or something in line. So a lot of times people will join the line, I believe, 10 minutes before the exams are released for people to sign up. So it's helpful to try to do that earlier than the actual time that they open up. Because of this, I had to take an exam about 40 minutes from me in Washington, D.C. I ended up staying in a hotel the night before just so I could cut out any variables of potentially traffic or my car breaking down, and then having to wake up earlier to get to the testing center. I was able to fit what little luggage I had brought for a night stay in the lockers that they provided at the testing center. Despite coming in at 7:30, I think that's the time I was supposed to come in, I didn't actually start my exam until 8:10 because everyone else was there on time, so they had a long queue for people to check in. So once you get to the exam center and you get checked in, they verify your information with you, they take a picture of you, and they scan your palm vein, I believe. I was given earplugs and over-ear headphones. It might have been an option for me to choose one or the other, but I ended up taking both and then just kind of switching between them depending on when they would get uncomfortable for me. So that kind of helped me stay focused throughout. One thing to keep in mind is people kind of come and go whenever they please during the exam because everyone kind of starts at a different time, and then ends their sections at different times. So don't be stressed out if you see people leaving earlier, leaving later than you, because everyone's kind of on their own schedule with this. Additionally, a lot of times it's not only people taking the MCAT there, they're taking other exams, which I didn't learn until a little bit before I'd taken the exam. For food, it took me a while to kind of nail down what I wanted to do to keep my energy up during the exam. But what I would do is I would eat a granola bar for the 10, the 30, and the last 10, and then I would have a Celsius, or I guess you could swap any energy drink at the 30, because I found that when I would get to bio and physics, my eyes were kind of glazing over and I was rereading things a lot of times. So I got used to doing that during my full lengths when I was practicing them. I ended up bringing my blue light glasses with me, which I do find that they help despite kind of mixed reviews from people overall. And that was to kind of prevent eye strain because I did find that to be an issue when I was practicing my full lengths. So I tried maybe using eye drops, but I found that the blue light glasses were kind of enough to help me. But the thing with that is that they have to search them and examine them when you bring them into the testing center, just to make sure you're not cheating with them in some way. For the most part, I took all of the time for the sections that I had, with the exception of Psych, which I had a lot of time left over, so I ended up taking a unscheduled break and just walked out, took a lap, and then came back to review my answers just because I had time and wanted to get out of the testing room for a little bit. But once you submit the exam, go home, obviously celebrate, and just forget that you ever did that for the next month or so, until you get your scores, hopefully. Another thing is, it's fun to kind of embrace how miserable it is with the other people at your testing center. I was talking with other people during my 30-minute break, just kind of like getting to know them and talking in general about like, you know, how we were doing and like how things were going, and that was pretty helpful to kind of keep my energy and my spirits up during the exam. I remember specifically one of the people I was taking a test with said that they were going to schedule a retake as soon as they got home, which could be helpful if you're not feeling confident after you take the exam, and feel like you might have to retake your score in the future, is to just schedule as soon as you get back, so that the time slots don't fill up. Okay, that is everything I have. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll also leave my email in the description for any questions as well. I sincerely hope this was helpful for any of you. I know that watching videos about people taking the MCAT, whether it was study tips, reactions, educational videos. They were all really helpful in me getting through this long process. And without further ado, here's my reaction video. Thank you guys for watching. Bye. My MCAT score came in today. I'm logged in here. I'm just gonna open it, we'll see. Oh my God. It's a 511, man. I don't even have words. I'm more than happy with this. Oh my God, dude. Okay, yeah, thank you guys.